And my advice to them was to not hear the noise as much, to continue doing the job that we've entrusted them to do.
So it was a hard, goodbye that I feel like I mourned the wrap of Snow White while I was in the middle of kind of getting my bearings on the Hunger Games set.
Have you ever wondered what happens when a beloved fairy tale collides with modern agendas and then gets roasted by the most infamous satirical cartoon on TV? That's exactly what went down when Rachel Zegler, the controversial new face of Disney's live-action Snow White, found herself caught in a storm. Her outspoken criticisms of the original story have drawn waves of backlash, and South Park wasted no time serving up a ruthless parody. But how did a simple remake spark so much outrage? And why is Rachel Zegler fuming over an animated show's comedic jabs? Stay right here, because the truth might surprise you more than any glass coffin or magic apple ever could. Over the past few years, Disney's been on a roll, remaking classic animated stories with new twists, new casts, and a fresh, modern outlook. Some fans applauded the effort, seeing it as a chance to update old fairy tales and introduce them to younger generations. But there's been a growing chorus of discontent, especially as the studio tinkers with treasured details that many believe define these stories in the first place. When the casting of Rachel Zegler as Snow White first made headlines, the immediate buzz was that she was a rising star, having won acclaim for her role in West Side Story. People were curious. Could she carry the weight of a legendary Disney princess and still infuse something new? But excitement started shifting to skepticism when reports emerged that Disney was making drastic changes to Snow White's plot. Traditional elements, like the 7 dwarves, the prince, and even that classic love story, were on the chopping block. The more Disney tried to update everything, the more fans felt an invisible line was being crossed.
When a creator has pitched you a great story and you've given them the ability to go out and tell that story, you've given them the resources, the money, the tools, the place to tell that story, that story is...
The biggest sticking point? This wasn't just about casting a Latina actress in a role famously described as having skin white as snow. In the eyes of many, it felt like a deliberate erasure of everything that made the 1937 original so enchanting. Rachel Zegler's interviews, where she described the original Snow White as outdated and problematic, didn't exactly build bridges. For a growing number of people, her commentary came off as dismissive, or worse, disrespectful to one of the most iconic animated films ever made. At first glance, Rachel Zegler seems like the perfect fit for a modern Disney princess. She's articulate, talented, and has an impressive vocal range. Yet, as soon as she started speaking publicly about her role, skeptics latched onto her every word. In multiple interviews, Zegler criticized the old-fashioned nature of Snow White's story, particularly the romance. She hinted that Prince Charming was irrelevant, joked about cutting his scenes, and suggested the new version would do away with the love angle entirely. For longtime Disney fans who grew up cherishing the story's innocence, this felt like more than just a fresh take. It seemed like a complete disavowal of what many consider an essential part of Snow White's journey. Imagine the story of Beauty and the Beast without Belle's empathy, or Cinderella without the transformation at midnight. To some, removing the prince from Snow White was just as unthinkable. But Zegler was unflinching, saying the old fairy tale wasn't reflective of modern values and that it needed a feminist overhaul. Then there was the Dwarves Controversy. Originally, Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs introduced us to a group of characters who were small in stature but big in heart.
is not designed right now to necessarily develop great leaders or to encourage more people to seek public office. It just is far more difficult. Now, I've never been in it, but from what I observe, it's far more difficult to run for office today than ever before.
Disney, fearful of causing offense, decided to remove or radically change the dwarves altogether. Instead of addressing concerns raised by the dwarfism community in a nuanced way, the studio seemed to opt for a complete rewrite. Once again, Rachel Zegler's public statements didn't offer reassurance. She echoed the sentiment that the story needed an extensive update. But her tone, described by some viewers as entitled or holier than thou, fanned the flames of an already heated debate. Anyone who's watched South Park knows they revel in poking fun at anything and everything, especially cultural trends that seem overblown or disingenuous. The animators behind the show aren't exactly subtle when they sense what they call pandering. So it was only a matter of time before they set their sights on Disney's latest round of remakes. That's where Into the Panderverse comes in. In this episode, South Park turned its iconic quartet, Cartman, Stan, Kyle, and Kenny, into adult women of color. This move was an obvious swipe at what many see as Hollywood's tendency to swap genders and ethnicities in established characters, all under the umbrella of so-called inclusivity. The parody called out the notion that you can't just slap a new demographic label on a character and call it progressive. Instead, the show argued, you end up cheapening the concept of true representation by making it feel forced, hollow, and contrived. As you might expect, the Snow White remake took a direct hit. The show openly mocked Disney's repeated attempts at modernizing classics by stripping them of the elements fans cherished most. And Rachel Zegler's interviews? Fair game. South Park depicted these changes as heavy-handed and comically extreme, with the unsubtle message being, are you really creating something new, or are you just pandering for the sake of buzz? Word on the street is that Zegler herself was not amused. She was already facing backlash from Disney loyalists and fans upset about the original story's overhaul. Then South Park came barreling in, turning the entire controversy into comedic fodder for millions of viewers. Allegedly, the actress took the episode as a personal attack, fueling rumors that she was irate about the portrayal and what it might do to her reputation.
She was like, Jacqueline, if they play Getaway Car or Maroon, she's on crisis watch. Not only did she play Getaway Car, she also played Maroon. I was having a mental breakdown in the audience at MetLife Stadium.
After all, when South Park lampoons you, it tends to stick in people's minds. Social media erupted the moment Into the Panderverse aired, adding even more layers to a conversation that was already loaded with tension. Disney fans who were lukewarm about the Snow White remake found validation in South Park's satire. It was as though the show had voiced what many were thinking. Stop gutting our childhood favorites in the name of an agenda. Meanwhile, supporters of Rachel Zegler argued that any actress stepping into such an iconic role is bound to face criticism. They insisted she was merely calling out outdated themes and pushing for a more empowering narrative. But even among those who champion representation and inclusive storytelling, there's been a sense that Disney's approach might be misguided. You can't just erase entire characters, like the Dwarves, and strip the romance from a famously romantic story without offering something equally compelling in its place. There's a fine line between modernization and sacrificing the soul of a beloved tale. Many say Disney crossed that line, and Rachel Zegler's interviews seem to confirm they were going all in on a revisionist take that left precious little of the original's warmth. Fan commentary ranged from measured critiques to outright fury. Some folks were frustrated that Zegler looked down on the classic Snow White, describing her as condescending. Others found her remarks refreshing, saying that maybe it's time we question fairy tale romances that revolve around a love-at-first-sight dynamic.
What was it like seeing yourself for the first time in full Snow White drag?
I love that description. It's perfect. Oh my God, well, when you get to wear Sandy Powell, first of all, insane. And then you get to be lit by Mandy Walker.
Regardless of where people landed, the consensus was clear. This remake was shaping up to be one of Disney's most controversial projects yet, and South Park had just poured gasoline on an already raging fire. Disney's had its share of controversies over the years. Remember the Little Mermaid remake? Casting Halle Bailey as Ariel kicked off heated discussions about whether the studio was ignoring the character's original portrayal or simply opening the door for a new generation to see themselves in the iconic mermaid. That adaptation still kept core elements: Ariel's longing for the human world, her love for Prince Eric, and the memorable songs. Many fans concluded that while the casting choice was bold, the essence of the story remained intact. Snow White is different. Far more elements appear to be scrapped or rearranged. The dwarves replaced, the romance diminished, the comedic sidekicks reworked into something unrecognizable. For a tale that kicked off Disney's entire animated legacy in 1937, these changes feel especially jarring. Critics argue it sets a dangerous precedent. If Disney's oldest and most cherished princess story can be so thoroughly reimagined, what's to stop the company from rewriting every classic to fit an ever-changing cultural checklist? One could argue that retelling fairy tales is part of Disney's DNA. After all, The Jungle Book, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, and many others were themselves adapted from older source material. But there's a stark difference between adapting a story and stripping it of its defining themes.
The one where he was in the boxing ring.
Boxing ring, and Howard Cosell, who was then a famous announcer for ABC Sports, introduced him. And I was asked at some point to get Mr. Sinatra Listerine. You're at Madison Square Garden. It's not like there's a Listerine store in Madison Square Garden. So I dutifully ran out, found a drugstore of some sort. This is before CVS. This is 45 years ago.
When you remove the prince and the dwarves, are you really making Snow White more relatable for modern viewers? Or are you just alienating fans who loved the original for precisely those elements? In that sense, the question isn't just about Rachel Zegler's take or South Park's roast. It's about whether Disney's pursuit of modern is overshadowing what made these stories timeless in the first place. Is the studio so afraid of being labeled old-fashioned that it's willing to jettison beloved plot points and characters without a second thought? And does calling a story outdated automatically mean it should be dismantled? South Park co-creators Trey Parker and Matt Stone have a long history of taking on colossal entertainment giants, and Disney is a frequent target. They've lampooned everything from Mickey Mouse's corporate tyranny to the company's acquisition of huge franchises like Star Wars and Marvel. Each time, they dial the satire up to 11, leaving no room for misinterpretation. They believe massive media corporations will twist any narrative for profit if it means attracting more viewers or appeasing the loudest online voices. In this case, their focus on pandering was almost laser precise. Fans who watched the episode recognized the stand-ins for Disney's practices immediately by having Cartman, Stan, Kyle, and Kenny transformed into adult women of color. South Park essentially said, "We see you, Disney. We see you swapping out classic characters for more diverse versions, yet ignoring any meaningful development." While real inclusivity typically means weaving new, well-written characters into fresh stories, the approach parodied here felt more like a surface-level makeover.
That would be my preference as well.
Why your preference?
Well, look, I'm going to be 72 years old tomorrow. I've put in almost 50 years. There are other things in life that I'd like to do. I also am confident that the board will be able to identify an able successor.
At least, that's what the show wanted to convey. For Disney, the timing couldn't be worse. The Snow White remake was already generating bad press, and now the biggest name in edgy cartoons has turned the controversy into comedic gold. Rumors suggest the company wasn't thrilled. They've allegedly tried to keep lines of communication open with South Park's creators to mitigate any further mockery, but if history's any guide, it's hard to muzzle a show that thrives on ruffling feathers, especially when a spotlight this bright is shining on Disney's questionable creative choices. Insiders claim Rachel Zegler felt blindsided. She believes she was championing a more empowering story and doing press interviews to explain why the new Snow White would be relevant to today's audiences. But her tone, interpreted as belittling the original movie, led to a tidal wave of online criticism. Fans were calling her comments tone-deaf, out of touch, and even disrespectful to Walt Disney's legacy. Then came South Park. Their depiction of the entire fiasco, though not mentioning Zegler by name, practically hammered home every complaint fans had. Instead of a spirited new princess, Snow White became the poster child for misguided corporate virtue signaling. Zegler, reportedly, did not see it coming and was left feeling that her reputation had been damaged by an animated show's brutal satire. Supporters say she merely tried to rectify age-old fairy tale tropes, but it quickly escalated into a PR nightmare. Hollywood watchers note that big studios often coach actors on how to address potential pitfalls in interviews, like when you're about to play one of the most famous princesses in history, for instance.
I feel like it was like that for a lot of us. It's easier for me than it was for Tom because I wasn't playing a character that had already existed in the previous films. And those performances are so wonderful that you don't want to try to recreate anything because there's the fear of failing miserably. But also it's 64 years before the original films take place, the original books, and Francis Lawrence, who directed Catching Fire and both Mockingjay films, and Nina, who produced all of the Hunger Games content, they didn't put any pressure on us to try to recreate anything.
Critics argue Zegler either got poor advice or ignored it. Others point to the possibility that Disney, in an attempt to appear progressive, gave her free rein to express dissatisfaction with the old Snow White. Either way, the outcome was the same. A media firestorm that overshadowed any positive buzz about the film itself. You might wonder if all this fuss is really just about a fairy tale. Isn't it normal for Disney to update things to stay in tune with the times? But the controversy touches on deeper issues: authenticity versus tokenism. respect for classics versus rebranding for modern audiences, and whether an iconic story can still be a source of enchantment if it's pulled apart at the seams. The original Snow White wasn't just another movie, it was Disney's very first feature-length animated film. It revolutionized the animation industry. It showcased groundbreaking techniques, introduced timeless songs, and carved a path for the countless Disney princesses who followed. Tampering with such a pivotal piece of cinematic history is bound to raise eyebrows, even more so if the changes appear to undermine what made it special in the first place. This is where South Park's satire resonates so strongly. The show asks a tough question. Is Disney genuinely trying to be inclusive, or is it merely chasing headlines and patting itself on the back for progressiveness? True diversity, after all, often means creating brand new narratives that celebrate different experiences, rather than shoehorning identity politics into existing ones. Fans of the classic Snow White aren't necessarily opposed to innovative storytelling, but they do have a point. If you strip away core elements like the prince and the dwarves, is it still Snow White? If you visit any Disney fan forum or scroll through social media, it won't take long to see the heated arguments playing out in real time.
Business with large Western companies and brands, but we bring to China a type of ideology, admittedly a relatively benign one as it relates to politics in China, but still a Western ideology. And in many ways, that had value to them.
Some individuals remain cautiously optimistic, hoping that the final film will manage to retain the sweetness that defined the original. Others have written it off entirely, insisting Disney has lost the magic touch and replaced it with corporate box checking. Critics have noted that unlike some previous remakes, such as Cinderella or Beauty and the Beast, which stayed relatively close to their animated predecessors, Snow White seems to be dismantled at its core. The heartwarming dynamic with the dwarves, gone or completely changed. The romance that anchored the story, apparently downplayed, if not erased. And Rachel Zegler's public statements, which should have excited viewers about a new take on an old favorite, instead came across like she disliked the film she was hired to remake. For a company like Disney, which once prided itself on the timeless enchantment of its stories, this is a precarious road to travel. They're risking alienating their devoted fan base, many of whom feel like these changes are less about modernization and more about sending a heavy-handed message. Sure, nobody expects a 2020s remake to maintain every single 1930s sensibility. But when a story is retooled to the point of being nearly unrecognizable, the question arises, why adapt this story at all? Part of the genius behind South Park's approach is that it doesn't simply say, diversity is bad or inclusivity is wrong. Instead, it satirizes the half-baked ways large media companies sometimes go about these initiatives. By turning beloved characters into wildly different versions of themselves, the show points out how ludicrous it can look when studios simply swap out superficial traits.
And my advice to them was to not hear the noise as much, to continue doing the job that we've entrusted them to do,
right?
Which is to tell the truth, to state the facts, to present the news in an accurate and a fair and in a timely basis.
Without any genuine depth or narrative integrity. In the case of Snow White, the Panderverse episode allowed fans to laugh at something they've been fuming over. It's one thing to read a heated tweet or see a blog post criticizing Disney's direction. It's another to watch an absurd, over-the-top caricature of the process playing out on primetime TV. Suddenly, the frustration feels validated. People who believed Disney was pandering for social media applause found confirmation in South Park's comedic takedown. Naturally, there's a flip side. Some argue that modernizing classical fairy tales is necessary to keep them relevant and ensure they don't perpetuate outdated narratives. But the line between meaningful update and shallow exploitation can be razor thin. South Park's comedic lens showed exactly how that line might be crossed and why fans are upset. As rumors fly about Rachel Zegler's displeasure with South Park's portrayal, it's worth noting that she hasn't publicly fired back at the show, yet. Some speculate she's been advised to lay low and let the controversy die down. Others think she might be preparing a more detailed response, particularly if the backlash intensifies. What's certain is that her relationship with the Snow White fanbase is complicated. She's been praised for her talent, but her outlook on the original story has overshadowed just about everything else. Depending on how Disney handles the marketing from here on out, she might find herself walking a tightrope between doubling down on her modern vision and offering reassurance to traditional fans that the essence of Snow White will remain intact.
The board was making a decision to make a change at the CEO level at Disney, and that they might ask me to step back.
And you
in.
say to her?
And I said to Willow, I'm getting this call. It's possible that I could get asked back.
And then there's the broader Hollywood climate. Disney is hardly the only studio accused of pandering. Reboots, remakes, reimaginings, call them what you will, are everywhere. Casting choices that defy the source material have become common enough to spark endless culture war debates. For Zegler, navigating these choppy waters could define her career for years to come. Will she be hailed as a champion of progressive reimaginings or criticized as the actress who failed to grasp the fairy tale magic that audiences still yearn for? In the aftermath of South Park's scathing parody, many wonder if Disney is second-guessing some of its creative decisions. After all, negative press can affect box office performance, merchandise sales, and theme park tie-ins. The talk around Snow White has shifted from excitement about a new adaptation to complaints that it's an unnecessary overhaul. If the studio doubles down, they risk alienating a significant portion of their audience. If they walk back changes to appease outraged fans, they risk looking inconsistent. Rumor has it that executives are keeping a close watch on social media sentiment, hoping the uproar will subside before the film's release. The trouble is that with each new interview or leaked detail, the conversation reignites, and South Park's episode is now part of that lore, something people will inevitably reference when discussing the downfall of Disney classics. If history is any indication, Disney will continue releasing remakes, each with some new spin or angle.
Anything that has to do with technology creating opportunity for us, I find very enjoyable. The creative process at its highest level is at times frustrating, but often, and fortunately for us, really enjoyable.
Whether they'll learn from the Snow White backlash is unclear, but one thing's for sure, the combination of Rachel Zegler's controversial remarks and South Park's laser-focused satire has made this remake a lightning rod in ways few could have predicted. In many ways, the Snow White controversy feels like a mirror held up to the broader entertainment industry. It reflects our collective anxiety over whether beloved stories can evolve without losing the magic that made us fall in love with them in the first place. On one side, there's an argument for progress, highlighting new perspectives, ditching outdated tropes, and appealing to diverse audiences. On the other side, there's a powerful call for tradition, honoring what these fairy tales meant to generations of fans and preserving the elements that touched hearts around the world. Rachel Zegler's journey embodies that tension. She stepped into an iconic role with the best of intentions, aiming to reshape a princess for the modern age. Yet the public reaction suggests a deep skepticism about whether her version of Snow White or Disney's interpretation is actually better, or just different in a way that feels forced. South Park, true to form, took that skepticism and turned it into a biting comedic episode, ensuring that anyone mildly aware of the situation couldn't ignore the deeper questions at play. Is the push for inclusivity becoming a box-ticking exercise? Are big studios coasting on nostalgia while promoting changes that don't genuinely enrich the story? And how does a young actress caught in the crossfire respond when satire frames her performance as the poster child for misguided woke culture?
I did. It was so fun. Oh my god, as a huge Disney fan, it was so exciting to finally get to go to D23. Yeah. I live on the East Coast, so I was never able to go, and also tickets sell out like in a flash. So it was so exciting to go, and my mom was super jealous because my mom is the reason I'm a Disney fan.
As the debate roars on, Disney's live-action Snow White remains in production. Behind the scenes, there are conflicting reports about reshoots, script revisions, and possibly even changes to marketing strategies. Some insiders hint that the backlash was more severe than Disney anticipated, prompting discussions about whether certain scenes should be altered to appease vocal fans. Meanwhile, the public is left to wonder if the final product will reflect the version Rachel Zegler described, or if last-minute adjustments might stealthily bring back some elements that were originally discarded. Will the prince be reinstated with a larger role? Will the dwarves be included in a form that resembles the original story? Only time will tell. There's also speculation about how the studio will handle promotions. Will they allow Zegler to speak freely in interviews, or will her talking points be more carefully rehearsed this time around? The stakes are high, and Disney likely wants to avoid another scenario where a single off-the-cuff remark sets off a media firestorm. This entire saga underscores a potential tipping point for how Disney approaches its classic properties. They're in the precarious position of wanting to appear forward-thinking while also maintaining the goodwill of a fan base that spans decades. After all, Disney wasn't just built on recent successes, it's built on a legacy of timeless stories that shape childhood memories for millions. If the Snow White remake flops, critically or financially, it might force the studio to rethink its approach to remakes. Instead of radical reinventions, perhaps they'll refocus on stories that respect their origins while making subtle, thoughtful updates.
The rice has to be body temperature, and if it takes too long to serve it, it's no longer body temperature. But what was interesting to me about him was he had 3 Michelin stars, and he was still trying to learn how to get better, how to be better.
Yes.
And I showed that to executives at Disney.
If, however, the film does well despite all the controversy, expect more of the same. Bigger changes, bolder reinterpretations, and a continued emphasis on checking every modern box. South Park's scathing commentary might serve as a cautionary tale. When satire resonates, it can become the defining narrative people remember. If Disney wants to avoid further ridicule, it'll need to prove it can deliver meaningful representation without sacrificing story elements that countless fans hold dear. You can't simply toss out the old formula without offering a new one that truly wins people's hearts. So, does this really spell the end of Snow White's magic? Or can Disney find a middle ground that embraces contemporary values while preserving the fairy tale's soul? The debate isn't just about one film or one actress. It's about how we, as an audience, engage with the stories that shaped us and how we want them to evolve for future generations. Rachel Zegler, for her part, has learned the hard way that diving into a cultural icon's shoes means more than just showing up on set. It means shouldering decades of nostalgia and treading carefully when you talk about a story so many people hold close.
She's my best friend, and she's the one who sent me the casting notice and said, "Thank me when you're famous." It's the craziest thing ever that it came true in that weird way, and that's why I bring her everywhere, and she's the best ever. But yeah, I put myself on tape. It's the worst tape you've ever seen in your life. I have no idea how I got the part still. And it's being used to teach future casting directors at NYU.
South Park's Parody thrust her, and Disney, into the spotlight with a blistering comedic lens, shining light on what some call pandering and others call progress. At this point, you've heard the back and forth, the accusations, the satire, and the heartfelt pleas from fans who just want Snow White to remain a beacon of timeless wonder. Where do you stand? Is the old fairy tale too dated for today's audience? Or is the new approach missing the point of what made it so special in the first place? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Did South Park go too far, or did they hit the nail on the head? Is Disney's reinterpretation a bold step forward or a misguided attempt to stay relevant? However you see it, one thing's for sure. The conversation around Snow White, Rachel Zegler, and Disney's modern remakes is far from over. Make sure you're subscribed if you want to stay on top of all the twists and turns in this unfolding saga, because if the past few weeks are any indication, the story of Snow White's transformation is only just beginning. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Until then, question everything, stay curious, and remember that sometimes the most unexpected source, like a sharp-witted animated show, can reveal the biggest truths about what's really going on in Hollywood.